tell about herself, but I know her through some presentations, some wonderful presentations at AZLA the past 2 years. So.
Oh, gee.
Go ahead and get started. I'm going to mute you again so you don't hear them all eating their chips.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome to Don't Sell 'em, Just Tell 'em, a book talks as an interactive way to share your passion for book discovery and engage students in the process. I'm really excited to be here as soon as I learn how to use PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. The whole point of this presentation, and it's an adaptation of one that I gave at AZLA this past fall, is that in a world of Yelp reviews and Amazon recommendations, today's consumers place more value in the opinions of a person than in the words of a book jacket. A well-executed book talk can capture a patron's attention and spur him or her into action. Your enthusiasm and firsthand knowledge can establish you as a trusted expert and start conversations that help turn non-readers into returning patrons. Today, you will walk away with a template for writing your own book talks as a singular entity, as well as pro tips on what makes a successful book talk as a collective noun. And I'll talk more about that later. All right, so I'm going to be very brave, and I'm going to turn on my camera. And so hopefully you can see me. Can you see me? All right, so.
Oh, yep, on the bottom.
Very good.
You're a tiny little square. Let me see if I can make you bigger.
I just thought you might want to put a face to a name. My name is Patty Jimenez, and I've been a librarian for 9 years here at Sunny Slope High School. And before that, I taught English for 13 years at Sunny Slope. So I've been here for a very long time. One of my favorite things as a librarian, and you know, you're librarians, there are a lot of things to really love about the library, but one of my favorite things is book talks, because there's that just exciting moment when you get the right book in a patron's hands and then you send them off on a journey of discovery and they start reading. And especially it's exciting when you do that for non-readers. So that's why this is kind of something near and dear to my heart, and that's why I wanted to share it with others, because as much as I do it, as I started talking to other librarians, I realized that it wasn't as second nature to them as maybe it is to me. And so having a formula to sort of work from at first, I think really helps. So with that said, this is my first time doing a webinar, from this side of the computer. And so I was a little nervous at first, and it's a little strange to be teaching to people that I can't see, who I can't see. And so, at first I sort of imagined that, my audience was like this, and I got a little nervous, but then I realized, no, you're with your own people. You're with other librarians who want the same thing you want, which is to take care of your patrons. And so I realized that you're probably more like this. And so that's how I'll be thinking of all of you in Yuma as I continue my presentation today. You're very adorable. And there goes the school bell. So let's talk about book talks and reader's advisory. So a book talk, and I want to just put out there that everything I'm saying is obviously my own opinion, my own kind of gleaning from lots of different sources and putting it all back together in a different way. So you may find information out there that's different, better, that you like more, but this is mine. And, it's been working for me. So book talk is a presentation designed to formally or informally persuade an audience to read a book or books. It's not a book review or a literary criticism. And when I say formally or informally, what I'm going to share with you today is more on the formal side because it's very structured. There are pieces that I want you to always put in. An informal book talk could use some of these pieces, but it would be more one-on-one. Whereas a formal book talk would be you and an audience, most likely. Now, the difference between book talk and reader's advisory is that then reader's advisory is this overall service that involves suggesting fiction and nonfiction titles to a reader through direct or indirect means. So you probably do a lot of different kinds of reader's advisory in your library because that's the big umbrella that everything else fits underneath. So book talks are underneath reader's advisory along with elevator pitches. And to me, those feel more informal as you're having that really quick conversation with a patron about a book, so 30 seconds to 2 minutes. You might do reader interest surveys, you might do gallery walks or other kinds of displays about books to do reader's advisory. You might even be really industrious and have book trailers. And I'm sure you're right now thinking of other ways that you've seen reader's advisory or that you do reader's advisory, and you can jot those down in your notes if you'd like so you remember them for later. But like I said, we want to focus on book talks today. So, what are the parts of a book talk? I feel like the book talk is sort of like a 5-paragraph essay. So there are going to be things that you absolutely want to have in there in that exact order. And then there are a couple of little, pieces that you can sprinkle in depending on the book, what fits best, depending on your audience. And then once you get comfortable with that format, then you can start to play around with it. So if you haven't done a lot of book talks before, stick with the structure at first and then go from there. So first you want to start out with the hook. Really important, just like your 5-paragraph essay. You want to make sure you have a way to really get your reader and draw them in. And there are a couple of fun ways to do this. You can start with a student or patron story. Maybe you heard about the book from a patron and you decided to kind of read it and then use it as part of your RA. So maybe tell them something that patron told you or how it related to that patron or what they thought of it, or relate it to your listener. If you're really keyed into the group that you're working with, you might know exactly why they would like this book. And I'll talk a little bit more about that knowledge of your audience, but that's going to draw them in even more if you're like, oh, you picked this out for us. You know us. You can also do a news item or a fact, something in current events to get their attention and relate it to something they already know about. You can start with the ever-present rhetorical question. Another really fun way to start a book talk is with fantastic first lines. For instance, you have just some books that start off really, really strong. So use that to your advantage and begin your book talk with those first couple of lines from the book. You can also go with the imagine if. It's a good way to start. Or think movie trailer first lines. In a world. Life in this imaginary world was pretty sweet until, or Joe always wanted to be a blank, but this happened. Just some ways to kind of get them interested and give them a little information about the kind of book they're going to be getting themselves into. If you can't think of any movie trailer lines, then you can simply Google movie trailer opening lines, and there is just a plethora of ideas out there. And I feel like those are really good sentence starters for us that we probably will sort of lose as we get better at this. But they're a great way to start, kind of some training wheels. Now, once you have your reader hooked, and that's only a couple of lines of text, you're going to move on to story and character. And this is tough for novels because you have a lot of characters and have a lot of plot lines going on sometimes. So always stick with your main character, so your protagonist, and always your main plot. Don't get into all the little side stories or all the other characters. Even if you have a really rich group of characters, keep it simple here so that you don't give too much away about the story and make your book talk 20 minutes long. Next, we'll move on to tone. And here is where you kind of warn your reader about anything in the book that might be kind of what they don't want. So perhaps if things are dark or gory or scary, those tend to be things that some readers definitely do not want. So let them know so they don't pick up a book and then they're sort of horrified as they start to read. Same thing with happy endings. Some readers don't want a happy ending. They want a complicated storyline and they want, things to be more realistic, and everything tied up very neatly in a bow is not very real life. Let them know whether or not the characters are likable or unlikable. Some people don't want an unreliable narrator or an unlikable character or an anti-hero. That's going to turn them off of the book. So just let them know up front if there's anything that might be an issue. Again, you don't have to give them the whole story, but you can just say, our protagonist is not a very nice guy. And so just give them some clues so that they can make good choices. Then we move on to comparison, and I think this one's really strong, and you can be done in a couple different ways. I like to pull comparisons from other media. So along with saying, well, if you like this novel, you'll like this book I'm talking about right now, but also compare it to books or TV shows or even video games. If you're talking to your teens in your library, then they might find more ways to connect with the video game media. Also, think about like the kind of reader, what they do in their spare time, how they might like to read a book. So this is an obvious example, but if you've got teens in your audience and you know that they are big video game players, then you might want to do a book talk and use that as a way to discuss Ready Player One. So try to find other things in their life. I know when I do Reader's Advisory with my students, and they come up, especially the non-readers, and they're like, well, can you recommend a book? And I'm like, well, tell me what you like. And they're like, well, I don't read. And I'm like, no, just in real life, what do you like? Do you like sports, animals? Do you craft? Like just trying to find something else, because they don't see that connection between what they do in real life and what they might enjoy reading. So use that to your advantage in book talks. Now, all of those pieces, the hook, story and character, tone, and comparison, non-negotiable. Always have those in there somewhere. There are a few additional elements that you might decide to use. All of them, some of them, none of them. One is comments from your patrons. And we talked about using that up in the hook. So if you didn't use it there, you might use it somewhere else. So what somebody else said about it, because maybe they don't believe you. You can say, well, this other person read it and they really liked it too, or they thought this about it. Consider doing a read aloud. All of my experiences are going to come from, working with teens, and you can extrapolate from there for who your audience is. But I know that while they might not admit it, teens love to be read too. So I tend to include a read aloud in many of my book talks because they enjoy that and it's good for them to hear it. And I think really probably adults would like that as well, because who's reading out loud to adults at this point? You might even tell your audience who the audience for this book is, so that they kind of just can decide personally, are they a part of that audience or not? You can talk about why you liked or didn't like the book. Just don't veer too much into book review territory. And then the last one, it's last for a reason, is pacing. Because I read really fast. I read super fast. And if I were to say to students, oh, you'll love this book, you can read it in an hour. Well, you know that reading speed is not necessarily indicative of intelligence. So I might say that to a kid, and after 1 hour, they're halfway through the book and they're sort of thinking, what am I doing wrong? So I never want to set my kids up for disappointment or failure by saying that. And the same thing is true of adults. You can have very intelligent adults who read slowly. So be careful with the pacing. Know your audience. If you know the people in your audience are avid readers and they want to know, hey, can I read this on a Friday night? Or is this a multiple weekend read? Go ahead and tell them that. But be careful that you don't set them up for failure. All right. So In order to help you see this formula for book talks, I have written a book talk for Landline by Rainbow Rowell. So listen for the key parts, listen for the things I've just talked about, and see if you can pinpoint which additional elements I've included in my book talk. Is there such a genre as supernatural, realistic, romantic fiction? If not, Rainbow Rowell just invented it. Georgie McCool is a 40-something career woman who may be getting the big break to direct her own television show with her best friend on their dream network. Too bad it's happening 7 days before Christmas. 7 days before she's supposed to travel with her husband and young children from California to Nebraska. Now she has to choose between career and family. Lose-lose. Her husband ends up taking their young daughters to his mom's house in Omaha while Georgie stays home to work. That's when it all starts to fall apart. Despite her explanations to the contrary, Georgie's mother is convinced that Neil has capital L left her, and she isn't too sure she's wrong. That's when Rowell's Deus Ex Machina is found in the closet of Georgie's childhood room, a magic fucking phone. Or, to be more precise, a yellow rotary phone Georgie bought at a thrift store in high school. In the age of immediate gratification through cellular device, Rowell throws Georgie a landline to help her get her life together. If you've read Rowell's other YA titles, Eleanor and Park and Fangirl, you already know that her gift of capturing dialogue and emotion is on point. Take, for example, the meet cute of Georgie and Neil during her junior year of college when she was the editor of the university humor magazine, The Spoon. Georgie turned the corner into the production room and stopped. The writers almost never went back to the production room. The artists hung out back there, and the paste-up people on the nights that The Spoon was going to press. Neil was sitting at a drafting table. He had a penciled comic strip laid out in front of him, and he was opening a bottle of India ink. There was a radio somewhere playing the Foo Fighters. Georgie thought about going back to the couch. "Hi," she said instead. Neil glanced up at her without lifting his head, then looked back at his comic. "Hi." He was wearing a black t-shirt under blue flannel, and his hair was dark and short, almost military short. "You're Neil, right?" He didn't look up again. "Right." "I'm Georgie." "Are you?" "Sorry?" "Are you really?" he asked. Yes." He nodded. "I thought it was a pen name. Georgie McCool. Sounds like a pen name." "You know my name?" Neil finally looked up at her, with round blue eyes and practically his whole head. "Your photo's in The Spoon," he said. "Oh." Georgie wasn't usually smooth with guys, but she was usually smoother than this. "Right. So are you, your comic strip. I came back to talk to you about your comic." Neil was focused on his page again. He was holding an old-fashioned pen. It looked like a fountain pen with a long nib. "Is there a problem?" "No," she said. I like it. I was going to tell you how much I like it." "Are you still going to?" His eyes met hers after a second, and she thought she might see a smile there. She smiled back. "Yeah, I really like it. I think it's the funniest thing in the magazine." She was almost sure Neil was smiling now, but it was just a twitch in his lips. "I don't know," he said. "People seem to like the horoscopes." Georgie wrote the horoscopes. In character, sort of. It was hard to explain. Neil knew she wrote the horoscopes. He knew her name. If you are a child of the 80s and 90s, you'll enjoy the subtle mentions of pop culture, like when Georgie worries that she has pulled a Marty McFly, so she digs out a Polaroid of her and Neil to make sure her life doesn't all disappear. Be warned, however, this book has all the feels: sadness, depression, romance, failure, mommy stuff, and humor. And while there is not a clear-cut happy ending, there is hope and possibility, which in the end is far more realistic. So, hopefully you noticed a few things that I threw in there. Obviously, I started with the hook, character, and plot. And then I went down and I threw in comparison and read aloud. I've got some audience mentions in there, other, 40-somethings who would appreciate the 80s and 90s references. And then some stuff about tone, because this book is about a marriage that might be falling apart. And that could really trigger some feelings for people who are either doing the same thing in their own life or have gone through that. And you would want to be really careful that you didn't send them into this strange romance sort of without warning. Now that's a book talk for one book. So that's one little thing. But really, when we talk about book talks, a book talk is a collective noun. It's not just one book talk, it's a group of book talks. So let's talk about how that works. You wouldn't just stand up in front of a group of 20 people and do one book talk and walk away. You would want to have several books to talk about. So when you're writing your book talk, think about telling a story with those books or using a central theme. It could be whatever holiday is happening, or it could be a season, or it can be your own. Maybe the book that you really want to talk about, say Landline, would be your starting point, and from there you would choose other books that sort of spin off of that first book. Use transitions between your book talks. You don't want to do that old radio thing where you're like, here's a book, now here's another book, here's a third book. Instead, try to build off genre, tone, or story so that you can kind of move from one book to the next. Kick it off really strong with a book maybe that you're super excited about or something that's really, really new that you want to get into your patrons' hands. Build up and then end with something really memorable. And you can do that by mixing old and new books, old and new titles, fiction and nonfiction. You can also, this happens to me because when I give a book talk, I give it 5 times a day. So what I book talked in first period, I usually have to change things up by the time I get to 7th period because they've, hopefully, if I've done a good job, taken all my books. So maybe include an author or a series because authors tend to be tonally similar. If you were doing something about memoir or about growing up and having people tell stories of their childhood, you pick maybe Gary Soto. And all of his stuff tends to be tonally very similar. So you could sub in Baseball in April. You could pull in some of his fiction, like Help Wanted, and it would all sort of fit into whatever theme you were working with. So if I were going to do a book talk, collective noun, inspired by Landline, which I had to think, what is it about Landline that I find charming or that kind of builds the theme? And I wanted to go with sort of unexpected / quirky romance. So then I started trying to think of other books that fit that bill, sort of unexpected romantic books, romantic stories that just don't follow the traditional trajectory. So I would start with Landline by Rainbow Rowell, and then I would move into High Fidelity by Nick Hornby. Again, looking at my audience here, I'm going to have boys and girls. Maybe you will as well. So I wanted to go with a romance that flipped to a male protagonist and flipped from being semi-realistic / strange fantasy to being all realistic. And I went from there into Stardust by Neil Gaiman because, again, kind of taking it and turning it. Now we're squarely in the zone of fantasy, but now instead of boy meets girl, it's more like boy meets falling star and falls in love. From there, kind of keeping that different type of romantic story, I went to The Night Circus, which is sort of a dark Romeo and Juliet, which is kind of saying something. And from there, I would end really, really strong with one of my absolute favorite books. And I just have to point out, I would never do this book talk for teens. This is with you in mind. But I would go from Night Circus into Fight Club, which is the strangest, most unexpected romance I could think of with Jack and Marla. So Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk, because while it's very violent and strange, there is a love story between the two of them, and I kind of like that. So it took me by surprise. So that's what my 5 book talk would be. Now I could do more than that. Now I could pull in some series, some other authors, and I could talk about 10 books. It just depends on how much time you have. But keep in mind that beginning, middle, and end of your book talk when you're planning it. And maybe you do mini book talks within your big book talk. So you have 5 of these unexpected romances, and then you have another theme that you explore. So there are some takeaways that you might want to consider, because it's great to have a book talk for your audience, but sometimes they're sort of like, wait, was I supposed to be taking notes? What was that book she talked about? So you might want to consider giving them something for when they leave, so they can come back to those books later. Now, I'm really lucky. My district uses Destiny, so what I tend to do is build a Destiny resource list for any book talk I give, and I label it book talk and the date that class came in, and then I list all of the books that I talk about, because then they can link directly into our catalog system, and they can, drag and drop those books into their own personal lists. You may not have that capability with your software, but you can do things like a book list that has many pictures of the covers on it. You could build a Google Doc maybe that you share. I like the idea of a shopping list, like a blank shopping list kind of a thing, maybe just a half sheet of paper where they would fill in the title of the book, and then they would have little check boxes, and it would say something like it, love it, gotta have it. Yes, I stole that from the ice cream place. Or a little place where they could say, if they didn't like it, maybe who else would like it. So they may hate that book or be like, I'm never going to read that, but I have a friend who would just love it. And so then you're moving, you're widening the circle, and you're reaching readers that aren't even in front of you. Annotated lists are great. I would just highly recommend that you don't hand those out until the very end of your book talk, or else they're just going to be reading and not listening to you. And I think there's something to be said for that performance aspect, and that hearing about a book versus just reading the recommendation on the paper, or reading the summary on the paper. I think bookmarks are a really fun idea. If you have the capability to make up bookmarks for each of your book talks, and you can say, here, take this with you. You'll always have it in your book, and you can see what maybe you want to read later on. Or do something with QR codes, because everybody loves to play with their phone, right? QR codes for read-alikes or with book covers, and taking them into your catalog and doing some fun things like that. So I just want to end with some do's and don'ts. And you'll notice that most of this is on your paper, because I didn't want to take a lot of time reading to you do's and don'ts. But there are a couple that I want to highlight. So one big do is write out your book talk. Treat it like it's a speech. Don't do it off the cuff. You'll be much happier with it if you do that. And consider, keeping a little journal with you when you read, because you want to take notes as you're going along. That's huge. When I first was writing the book talk for Landline, I hadn't done that. And so when I was getting ready for my presentation in November, I was doing that really annoying thing of practically rereading the book, trying to remember where the quote was. I could remember the moment I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't remember where it was. So I was having to skim all over again from the beginning of the book to find it. So do yourself a favor. Keep a pack of Post-it notes or something, and keep track while you read, because that also gets you to read with your audience in mind. Goodreads, you probably already use. That's a good place to sort of keep information about books that you're going to want to book talk, or keep a running Google Doc that you can access from anywhere. You can always go back and edit later, and you can use that initial text that you write. You can use it for book reviews that you write, maybe for your blog. You can use it for book lists that you put out for patrons. You can even pull from it to do social media. Anything that's going to help your library get that out to your patrons and bring them in the doors. I know I've touched on this next one quite a few times, but I cannot stress it enough. Know your audience. For me, that means knowing what they're studying in class so that I might connect to that, knowing what a teacher wants them to read or needs them to read for something. That's more my English teachers, and also their reading level. For you, that might just be the kind of things that they like, what's going to be too controversial for them. Just know your audience, know your patrons, and that's good advice beyond book talks. And the last big do is think about your logistics when you're giving a book talk, because it's not just the text, it's not just what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. So if you're in a room with people, where will you stand? How are you going to display the books so that you can talk about them, but also they're accessible to your group once you're done? And are you prepared for multiple groups in a day? So if they take all the books the first time out, are you prepared for that, or are you just done? Now let's talk about the don'ts. There's not too many down here, but a big one is be careful that you don't use books that are too complex or too simple, because you won't have very much to talk about, or you'll have too much to talk about. Don't use books without wide appeal. And again, know your audience. So if you've got a book with a very short appeal, but you know your group and you know it's just perfect for them, then that's great. Be careful about using books that are too controversial or too preachy, because then they're going to think that that's what you think, or that's what you want them to think. So be careful. And then, don't use books that are inappropriate to your audience. And again, that goes back to know your audience. So we have some resources. You probably use all of these already, so I'm just, preaching to the choir on this, but Booklist is great if you haven't used it before. I really like RA for All by Becky Siegel-Spratford. If you're not familiar with her, I did a lot of research on her blog as I was preparing for this to make sure I wasn't just making up crazy things, and I wasn't, mostly. So I like RA for All at blogspot.com. That's a good one, and obviously Goodreads. I mean, such a source of information. So we have a little bit of time left, so I want to open it up to questions from you and see if there's anything I can clarify or anything else that you have, questions about.
I've got you unmuted. So, does anybody have any questions? Questions or comments?
I was just sort of wondering, you're talking from a school library point of view, and it's a little bit easier, I think, to know your audience because you know you're going to be talking to high school students.
Mm-hmm.
But what would you do if you're, like a lot of us are, a public librarian that just works with a large age range, a large cross-section of the community? Do you need to be kind of, generic in your selection of books for book talk? Or would you do something a little bit more specific, like today's like a science fiction book talk day or something like that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess you can look at it from two different ways. You could definitely just play it safe, knowing that you might have huge age ranges. It would be interesting to pick a theme and then have a kids book, a YA, an adult, some adult stuff that transfers down to YA, some YA that transfers up to adult. That way you're kind of getting everybody in. And that's why I like to mix fiction and nonfiction, because we also get our men and our women, our boys and our girls kind of taken care of as well. So yeah, you could kind of play it safe and kind of go all over the place. Or I would think in a public library setting, it would be more like you would have advertised that you were doing this book talk, right? And so that people would plan and then they would show up. So you could advertise, hey, this book talk is about these kinds of books. So they can sort of form their own audience identity. They're going to be like, well, I'm not really interested in going to a book talk about sports fiction, so I just won't go to that. But the people who do come will be into that. So it's more of like you're going to build the book talk, and then your audience will find you. So I could see it going both ways. Does that help?
Yes. Although, I don't know, our situation sometimes, especially at branch libraries, is different because even when you hear something for the specific age group, you'll have like the grandmother will bring their grandchild to something that's not necessarily appropriate, or you'll have like parents that will bring their entire family. And so you might be there for one thing but get something completely other. So
Right.
that's
Yeah, so you wouldn't want to do what I do, and you wouldn't want to curse in your book talk. But and I think that if you have your book talks written out ahead of time, that means you sort of practice them a little bit in the writing and the editing. So once you get to your book talk and there's somebody's grandmother with a baby on her knee, you can kind of adjust. And I think that also speaks to that idea of have maybe a few more books ready to go, because you might be like, nope, I want that one about decapitation, and sub
you
something.
recommend maybe like over planning in a way, like maybe you're only going to book talk 5 books, but you bring 10 book talks with you just in case you have to throw something out, or?
Absolutely. It's always better to have more content than not enough. That's goes for the classroom and planning menus for parties. Always have more than you need.
Anything else? All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for you, Patricia. Thank you so much for doing this. We very much appreciate it.
You are so welcome. Listen, if later on you are working, repairing books or doing something, and your brain decides it has a question, go ahead and write down my email address there. I think it might be on your notes as well. And feel free to email me anytime, and I'll be happy to get back with you and try to help you in any way that I can.
Awesome. I was going to ask you something or say something, but I forgot what it was. So I'm sure once I remember it, I'll email you.
Awesome.
I know where to find you.
That's true.
Well, you did a great job, especially for your first webinar.
Oh, thank you. Did I get like a merit badge or something for that?
You do. I'll send you a merit badge.
All right, you guys have a great.
That was for you, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you very much again, Patricia.
All right, well, thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. I'll get in contact with you. I'll email you today.
All right, fabulous. You guys have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye. I'm going to hang up now.